Scientific investigation of the higher nervous psychic activity. Quote, "The laws governing complex nervous activity are developing on a purely objective basis of natural science, and mysterious mechanisms are gradually appearing clarified." I.P. Pavlov. The possibility of the study of the large cerebral hemispheres by means of stimulation originated very recently. There were no previous attempts of experimental study or psychic phenomena, i.e., of the activity of the large cerebral hemispheres. This field remained the domain of various guesses, mostly of an idealistic type, directed toward the search for the location of the soul. In the 17th century, an important event in physiology took place. It was demonstrated for the first time that, upon stimulation of the surface of the brain with an electric current applied to certain areas, various movements were observed in the animals. These methods of investigations, somewhat modified in their technical use, have reached our times and preserved certain value in the solution of a number of problems. However, it became clear within a short time after their appearance that these methods of stimulation did not open any worthwhile avenues of research. The reason for it was that only comparatively limited areas of the cerebral hemispheres, or location sites, of the motor centers. One part of the cortical surface of the cerebral hemispheres represents the area where visual, acoustic, and other centers are located. Upon the stimulation of these areas, there are no visible changes in the animal's condition observed. Finally, the major part of the cortex pertains to the so-called mute zones, where irritation, again, produces no effects which would manifest themselves externally. The method of irritation enabled the experimenters to establish the correct position of the motor centers only. For a more profound study of the functions of the cerebral hemispheres, this method did not prove suitable. Great hopes and interests were created at about the time by another method which had been developed, the removal of parts of the brain. Various sections of the cerebral hemispheres were removed or destroyed surgically or by means of chemical substances, also by freezing or burning out. Upon the animal's recovery, observations were carried out of the appearance of functional disturbances. The animal lost its hearing faculty, vision, and sensory properties of the skin. However, this method too proved unsuccessful. As soon as the location of the visual, acoustic, or tactile centers has been ascertained, the further use of this method could add nothing to our knowledge of the function of the brain. We must also point out that the method of removal of parts of the brain caused negative sequels which originated in connection with the damage to the central nervous system. As one scientist said, "A physiologist who is attempting to study the functions of the brain by means of removing its parts would appear in the same absurd position as a man shooting at a watch from a rifle and trying to learn the mechanisms of how it works." In inflicting rough damage to the nervous system, he, as Pavlov said, was causing a veritable ruin of the nervous activity. The scarification of the nervous tissue which followed the damage completed the deep disturbances of the functions of the central nervous system. To this attest convolutions which often appeared in connection with the formation of scar changes in the brain of the dog after the inflicted injury. Even when the area of damage was small, the convolutions were so violent and frequent that the animal perished sooner or later. Besides removal of the cerebral cortex, invariably leads to disturbances in other parts of the brain. In evaluating the significance of the methods of stimulation and removal of the parts of the brain for the purpose of studying its functions, one must come to the conclusion that neither of them justified the great hopes which had been originally entertained. At the time, one cannot deny the fact that with the aid of these methods, a number of very important data have been obtained. The location of higher motor and sensory centers has been demonstrated for the first time. With this, however, the usefulness of both methods has been exhausted. The main takes of the physiology of the brain is the study of the process which are at the base of its psychic activity. The investigation approaches which existed at the time in physiology offered no possibility of solving this basic problem. Of even less value in this respect were various anatomical means of the study of the brain. There have been many attempts of this type, but the results proved to be of little value. One can name various scientists who try to find the dependence between the weight or volume of the brain and its functions, and the relationship between the degree of development of various parts of the brain and the faculties of man. Some thought that the shape of the cranium corresponded to the development of various sections of the brain. The cranium, allegedly, develops certain protuberances or curvatures. Phrenology, a quack teaching, stating that palpation of the cranial surface and its irregularities enable one to determine the faculties and character of man, became quite popular. The phrenologists claimed to be able to determine the presence of mathematical, philosophical, and the protuberance of matrimonial fidelity, as well as the one of the sense of justice. They could find, of course, one of religiosity. Much attention was devoted to the attempts of determining the degree of development of cerebral functions by the distribution, shape, and the number of cerebral convolutions. However, scientific data have proven that these structural characteristics, weight, volume, convolutions, are too crude, and that they could not be utilized not only in the evaluation of isolated characteristics, but even of the general level of development of the functions of the brain. This pertains to the average indicators in a normal individual. Of course, the underdevelopment of the brain, which is expressed in its unusually small weight, corresponds also with its insufficient function, as is observed in hereditary idiotism. If, however, we speak of the average normal weight of the brain, even considerable variations of this index will tell us nothing as to the functional activity. In regard to the number of convolution on the cerebral surface, it has been observed that some singing birds have a brain much richer in convolutions than the higher primates. This fact alone indicates that the significance of the convolutions is very relative. It is interesting to note that one scientist has been saying all his life that the average brain of a woman weighs less than that of a man's. After his death, his brain was weighed. Its weight was considerably lower than the average weight of a woman's brain. We must emphasize, however, that the study of the brain structure bears important significance as to the evolution or evaluation of its functions. There are facts indicating that the methods of study of the fine brain structure, which are being developed now, especially of the relationship of various microscopic elements, histology of nervous tissue, and the characteristics of the brain, have a great future. Future histophysiology, i.e., the joint study of the structure and functions of the brain, has indubitable perspectives. We mentioned above the crude anatomical methods of investigation, particularly common in the pre-Pavlov area of physiology. The evaluation of the psychic faculties of man were made on the basis of these investigations. They are now abandoned on account of their unscientific character. Still, they are not forgotten by some and appear once in a while. Thus, for instance, certain ideologists of fascism were attempting to utilize them. One of the theoretical premises of fascism was the attempt to develop the teaching of the inequality of various races. One is called racism. In their aim to justify the aggressive colonial policy of imperialism, the racists advanced an unscientific and inhuman theory, which boiled down to the statement that humanity is divided into higher races, master and lower races, slaves. Unable to justify racism scientifically, its adherents are attempting to find proof in the anti-scientific rubbish of discussion of the significance of the cerebral weight, volume, and convolution, etc. Long ago relegated to the archives. The racists find it convenient not only because it creates an illusion of a scientific foundation, but mainly because of the extreme complexity of measuring the true volume, surface, and other indexes of cerebral development. Since the brain normally represents a jelly-like mass, one can shuffle the figures at will in determining the surface volume of the brain removed from the corpse. We have already mentioned that, within the limits of the normal average of structure and size, no deviations, even considerable ones, in the weight or surface structure of the brain have any significance whatsoever in the evaluation of the level of perfection of its functions. I.M. Sekanoff took a sharply negative stand in regard to such attempts for connecting cerebral functions with the variations of its external, curdily anatomic features. He stated, quote, "The character of the psychic content is 99/100 conditioned by training in the wide sense of the word, and is only 1/100 dependent on the individuality. This does not mean, of course, that I wish to imply that one can change a fool into a clever man. It will be tantamount to giving his hearing faculty to a man born without the acoustic nerve. My idea is this: an intelligent Negro, Lapindian, Bashkirian, subjected to European training in European environment, can become a man, very little different from in his psychic content from an educated European." The review cited above proves that the methods of the study of the physiological functions of the brain during the pre-Pavlov period must be considered unsatisfactory. Pavlov was well aware of it when he undertook the study of the function of the cerebral hemispheres. It was clear to him that the physiologists of his time did not possess satisfactory methods of study of cerebral hemispheres. This was particularly brought out by the following incident which occurred in the laboratory at that time. In discussing with one of his associates the results of an experiment which had been carried out on a dog, Ivan Petrovich completely disagreed with him. The talk was in regard to the observation of the so-called psychic salivation originating not when the dog was fed, but from the appearance and odor of food when the dog was only shown the food. As usual, an argument ensued. The objections to Pavlov's point of view were based on idealistic positions, and guided by the subjective evaluation of the condition of the animal. One man stated that the dog salivated because it was hungry. The other spoke of its agitation. Much later, when reflecting on the nature of the psychic activity in dogs, Pavlov said in recalling this argument, quote, "An unprecedented event took place in the laboratory. We were in sharp disagreement with each other on the interpretation of this world of ours, and we just could not arrive at some mutually acceptable conclusion." He remembered one of his associates, said Pavlov. There he was, with his keen mind, able to understand the joys and triumphs of the investigating thought. How great was my surprise when this true friend of the laboratory showed real and profound indignation when he heard for the first time of our plans to investigate the psychic activity of a dog in the same laboratory and with the same methods which he had used up till now for the solution of various physiological problems. The subject matter was the objective study of the physiological reflexes or reflex processes in animals. Pavlov understood then already that the contact of the true experimental natural science with the ultimate threshold of life will not be effected without serious misunderstandings and clashes. Nevertheless, he decided that the attempt to analyze psychic phenomena by identifying one's own mental state with the alleged mental processes in the dog, i.e., subjective treatment of phenomena, was absolutely useless. The problem could be solved by the objective method only. The mystery remained unsolved. There was no clearness. One had to discuss conceptions, the investigation of which seemed to be beyond the realm of possibility. However, the genius of the scientist could not reconcile itself to this state of affairs. There had to be an exit out of this blind alley. I.P. Pavlov wrote that he had soon become convinced that there was no sense and no exact knowledge to be derived from a physiological or psychological approach to this problem, that to start guessing what the dog feels, thinks, etc., would lead to nowhere. The stirred mind of Pavlov revived with new force and impression which had influenced him back in his adolescent days. He wrote of it in a later date. Quote, "The main impetus which prompted my decision, though I had not realized it at the time, was the influence of a talented brochure by I.M. Shekhanov, the father of Russian physiology, under the title The Brain Reflexes, 1863, which had impressed me a long time ago during my adolescence. The effect of a new thought, strong in its newness and faithfulness to actuality, is always profound, especially when one is young. Pavlov, already then slated to corroborate experimentally the ideas of Shekhanov, loved in later years to repeat frequently Shekhanov's words. Quote, "The entire infinite variety of the external manifestations of cerebral activity is reduced in the final analysis to a single phenomena, muscular motion. Whether a baby is laughing at the sight of a toy, or a Gibaldi is smiling when he is being hounded for his excessive love of his country. Whether a young girl trembles at the first thought of love, or Newton creates world laws and is writing them down, there is always the final fact, the muscular motion." Pavlov was the first to advance the suggestion that psychic salivation is nothing else but a typical reflex of the brain. This thought seemed to confirm Shekhanov's words. Let us enter the world of phenomena which is born as a result of cerebral activity. It is said that this world embraces the entire psychic life. It suffices to us, physiologists, that the brain is the organ of the soul, i.e., the mechanism which, once put into motion by whatever causes, leads in the final result to the aggregate of external phenomena which characterizes psychic activity. Some are under the erroneous impression that it was Pavlov who discovered the very phenomena of psychic salivation. The so-called psychic salivation was well known hundreds of years ago. Still, this phenomenon somehow remained unnoticed. Only the genius of Pavlov could reveal the importance to physiology of this simple everyday occurrence. Pavlov was able to grasp that any phenomena of the external world could serve as the stimulation of the salivary gland. If this is the case, then we can obtain the reflection of everything of the outside world in the salivary gland. Obviously, the entire content of this so-called psychic function can be thoroughly investigated by objective means. The entire soul can be squeezed into certain rules governed by such objective study. I.P. Pavlov arrived to this conclusion after numerous laboratory observations. Indeed, bread is shown to the dog. The dog begins to secrete saliva, though it receives no food. This is an example of the unusual psychic salivation. Physiologically speaking, it is a reflex, no doubt, but a reflex intimately connected with psychic processes at the same time. If saliva is secreted at the sight, smell, and in humans even at the recollection or imagination of food, can there remain any doubt that in these cases the physiological function, the salivary reflex, is directly connected with various psychic states. After a persistent reflection on this subject, after a difficult mental struggle, said Pavlov, he decided, in facing this so-called psychic agitation, to remain in the role of a pure physiologist, i.e., an objective outside observer and experimenter dealing exclusively with external phenomena and their iterations. Pavlov loved to stress, quote, "To a naturalist, everything is in this method." Thus, the main event happened. A correct method has been found of studying what became known as psychic activity, and what Pavlov later named the higher nervous activity. The strict objectivity of Pavlov's method of conditioned reflexes was inextricably connected with the idea that the entire activity of the central nervous system and all organic functions in general are caused by certain changes in the external world which surrounds the animal, or by various processes which are taking place within the organism. In other words, all phenomena in the organism, the most complicated psychic processes included, originate and are effected under the influence of certain definite causes, which are connected with various changes in the external or internal medium of the animal. The necessity of an objective approach to the study of phenomena required also an objective terminology. Terms connected with the idealistic concept of psychic were rejected, and psychic salivation was named a conditioned reflex. Thus, the group of psychic conditioned reflexes was constrained or contrasted against the natural, unconditioned reflexes. The basic differences between them were as follows. Conditioned reflexes, in contrast to the so-called unconditioned natural reflexes, represented reactions which have been acquired by the animal in the course of their individual development. The conditioned reflexes can be, as experiments have shown, unstable as compared to the unconditional reflexes. They could disappear under certain conditions and reappear once more. In the realization of the conditioned reflexes, the main role was played by the activity of the higher sections of the brain and its cortex, while unconditioned reflexes manifested themselves even after the removal of large cerebral hemispheres in the animal. Placing meat in the mouth of an adult dog invariably induces salivation. This is an unconditioned food salivation reflex. However, if the dog is only shown the meat and not allowed to eat it, teasing the dog, salivation takes place just the same. This is a conditional food salivation reflex. In this case, the mere sight stimulates salivation. A conditioned reflex of this kind is not innate, but is acquired by the dog in the course of its life. If a puppy who has been receiving only milk and bread since birth is shown sausage, there will be no secretion of saliva. If the sausage is brought close to its snout, the puppy will turn away and even growl. Its attitude will be as if the sausage were a stick, not food. However, if after showing the sausage, one succeeds in getting the puppy to eat it, to reinforce, as it is said, the showing of the sausage with the act of eating it, then the sight and odor of the sausage will invariably produce in subsequent tests a group of reconditioned reflexes in the form of movements of the puppy in the direction of the sausage, squealing, salivating, etc. One can complicate the conditions of the experiment and form an artificial conditioned reflex parallel with natural ones. The feeding of the puppy can be accompanied by a ringing of a bell. If this act is represented several times or repeated several times, it suffices subsequently to ring the bell only without giving food, and the puppy will pull itself to the manager, where it usually receives food, will start licking its lips and salivating. Thus, the bell ringing acquired the significance of a signal for the subsequent feeding, and the puppy acquired a conditioned reflex to the bell ringing. As a result of the investigation conducted by Pavlov, the basic conditions were established which were needed for the formation and preservation of various conditioned reflexes. It turned out that any phenomena of the outside world which are capable of stimulating the nerve cells of the brain can be used as signals for the formation of conditioned reflexes. It has been proved possible to produce a conditioned reflex not only to the action of a certain stimuli, light and sound, but even to the elimination of the continuously acting stimulants, for example, in connection with the onset of darkness after continuous light, or silence after continuous ringing of the bell. Definite time intervals may serve as conditional stimulants. This was elicited as follows. The animal received food every 10 minutes under strictly invariable conditions. After a certain number of these feedings, it was observed that the dog which remained standing quietly in its stand began to turn around, lick its lips, and pull to the manger. It began to salivate, though it received no food. Here was a conditioned reflex induced by a certain time interval. The time element also proved to be a real stimulant which, as Pavlov pointed out, could be subjected to exact investigation. Following the formation of conditioned reflexes on the activity of the digestive organs, similar reflexes were established on the functions of the kidneys, cardiovascular system, the process of metabolism, etc. Thus, it was proven that, by means of a conditioned reflex, one can connect various activities of the organism and the functions of any organ with the cerebral cortex. The fact that Pavlov investigated conditioned reflexes mostly on the salivary glands was due to the convenience of this procedure as compared to others. Indeed, it was possible to measure correctly to the degree of the reflex by the quality of the secreted saliva, and it was easy to evaluate the quality of the saliva by analyzing its content. Besides, the function of the salivary glands is to a large extent connected with the activity of the brain and depends on very little on the state of the organism. The method of salivary conditioned reflexes was only one of the methods on the basis of which the regulating processes of the cerebral cortex were studied. Other investigations employed, as a conditioned reflex method, the movements of the animal's extremities in response to a painful irritation. The results showed that Pavlov's selection was more successful. This was partly due to the fact that the motor conditioned reflexes are less stable and are more difficult to measure quantitatively. However, independently of the methods used by scientists to study salivary or motor reflexes, the conditioned reflex represents a universal function of the higher sections of the brain. As we have already indicated, any activity of the organism can be included in the conditioned reflex arc. The conditioned reflex function of the brain is its universal function because it manifests itself under all life circumstances, when the animal and man have acquired experiences. So far, we have learned only the most elementary types of conditioned reflexes, the examples of which are indicated above. Of course, the true basis of psychic activity is represented not by these simple reactions only, but by a great variety of others, more complicated conditioned reflexes, by their most complex associations and combinations. The task of future study is to analyze these reflexes, but even at present time, we are unable to cite examples of some conditioned associations of a more complex character. We described above an example of a conditioned reflex induced by the simultaneous employment of a conditioned and non-conditioned stimulation. This is the usual conditioned reflex. One can make this reflex produce, for instance, by the flash of an electric bulb, a very stable one. In order to achieve this effect, we have to produce, as was pointed out previously, a large number of conditioned and non-conditioned combinations of stimulations. In the end, the conditioned stimulant acquires the ability and force almost equal to that of the non-conditioned stimulant. We can use in this case any other natural agent or neutral agent, let us say a bell, and begin to combine sound with light. After the repeated use of the two agents, we shall note that the bell was assumed the role of the conditioned stimulant. With the use of the bell alone, we shall induce salivation, though at no time was ringing accompanied by feeding. A conditioned reflex of a second order has been formed. We can visualize the formation of a conditioned reflex of the third, fourth order, and so on, if we had been able to produce a very stable conditioned stimulant in the reflex of the subsequent order. A sort of multi-level conditioned reflexes will originate, of which each subsequent reflex is built on the preceding one. The so-called associations, which have been long known in psychology, but which up to now received no explanation, are closely connected with these types of reflexes. The associations originate when two or more phenomena which accompany each other in time. A certain contact is established between the centers which affect these reactions. If one of these phenomena assumes the character of a conditioned stimulant, it begins to produce a reaction also under the effect of another stimulant. In this case, the stimulant, which has never been reinforced by an unconditioned stimulant, enters the contact as the second conditioned stimulant. If we shall call the usual conditioned reflex a conditioned unconditioned reaction, then in the case of association, we must speak of a conditioned conditioned reaction. Pavlov considered associations as the very basis of mental activity. Why, this is exactly the way our mind works, he used to say, in observing associations in higher primates. The complex conditioned stimulants play a very important role in the development of psychic activity. We generally use separate stimulants in the laboratory: bell, electric light, whistle, etc. Under natural conditions, however, the animal frequently comes in contact with a large complex of conditioned stimulants. For instance, the sun is rising, the light is changing, the temperature and the air movement are changing, the degree of humidity varies, the birds are waking up and fill the surrounding space with their cries. This sort of most complex aggregate of stimulants represents the conditioned stimulant for the definite conditioned reflexes of the animals. Even in the laboratory, we come across some complex forms of conditioned reflexes. The so-called situational reflexes, which originate in response not to isolated stimulants, but to complexes of stimulants which represent the entire setting of the experiment. We shall finally wake up a special group of so-called tracer-conditioned reflexes. Up to now, we cited examples of reflexes which were produced in responses to one or another acting stimulant. Investigations have shown, however, that it is possible to form conditioned contacts not in response to a present acting stimulant, but to its traces. In a case of this type, the conditioned reflex has been formed as follows. The bell rang for a while, then it stopped. 1, 2 minutes passed, then the animal is fed. At this, the trace left by the sound stimulant, i.e., the residual stimulation in the central nervous system, coincided in time with the agitation due to feeding. It turned out that the conditioned reflex could form also on the trace of the previously employed stimulant. It was manifested thus. During the action of the bell, the animal remained quiet and continued to be quiet for a minute and a half following the ringing of the bell. However, as the duration of the interval approached 2 minutes, i.e., the moment when the animal usually received its food, it began to show anxiety. The saliva appeared, the dog pulled itself to the manger. Obviously, the stimulant in this case was the residual or trace stimulation left after the ringing of the bell, and not the stimulating effect of the ringing itself. The cerebral cortex possesses a highly expressed faculty to preserve traces of stimulations which it receives. To explain it, we shall call to your attention to our memory. The cerebral cortex, as well as we all know, can retain traces of impressions received by everyone of us, even in early youth. These traces may be preserved for scores of years, even during the entire life. At times, these traces come back to life. We actually live through some or other recollections. It is easy to see from the cited above that the conditioned reflexes which are formed in the cerebral cortex on the traces of various stimulations are of the utmost importance to the process of psychic activity. These examples indicate that very complex forms of conditioned reflexes are at the base of psychic activity. Only certain types of these reflexes are known at the present time. Many of them remain the task of future studies. An important characteristic of a conditioned reflex is its mobility, its changeability. To be more precise, the conditioned reflex can be very constant or highly unstable, depending on various conditions. It depends on whether the signal significance of a conditioned stimulant is preserved or not. If the animal receives its food while it is invariably accompanied by some sound, the latter will always retain its significance as a signal of feeding. The sound will produce a complex of food reactions which generally take place only upon feeding. Though in this case there was no food present. However, if the circumstances change and the animal stops receiving food with this signal, the conditioned stimulant loses its value as a signal, and the conditioned reflex will gradually weaken and finally disappear altogether. We witness here the faculty of the cerebral cortex to promptly remove unnecessary activity by means of utilization of its function of inhibition. The conditioned reflexes are constantly changing under their effect of the environment. This is the most characteristic trait of the conditioned reflexes, which demonstrates their biological role in the adjustment of the animal organism. Indeed, the animal encounters most diverse stimulants in the conditions of its natural environment. There are the effects of light and darkness, sounds and silence, changes in the temperature and velocity of the air, changes in humidity, variations of pressure, etc. These and many other phenomena may, under certain conditions, serve the animal as signals of obtaining food or as warnings of an enemy attack. Any change in the external medium or in the internal state of the animal may become a conditioned stimulant or a conditioned signal. One alternating signalization, as Pavlov calls it, takes place, which is the more mobile, the better the animal is adjusted to the environment. What is described above represents the main thesis of Pavlov's teaching, as evaluated from the biological point of view. The highly important role of the cerebral cortex consists, in this respect, in its property to maintain stable associations with the external medium, with its stimulants which retain their value as signals, and in its inhibiting reaction to the stimulants which have lost their role as biological signals. This ensures the animal the possibility of an unlimited adjustment to the environmental changes. The formation of temporary functional associations corresponds to the conditions of the existing situation. This remarkable property of the central nervous system, reinforced through hereditary acquired facilities, is at the basis of development of the higher nervous activity of animals, psychic activity of animals. The unconditioned reflex represent reactions which are affected by animals immediately following birth, suckling, swallowing, sneezing, etc. These reflexes are inherited. They are very stable and are manifested in a stereotypical manner by all representatives of a given species. The unconditioned reflex is a comparatively inert function and undergoes reorganization under exceptional conditions only. It depends, to a great extent, on the stability of the nervous paths within the limbus of which these unconditional reflexes are affected. In case of sudden environmental changes, one seldom observes any adjustments of the unconditioned reflexes which would correspond to the new situations. It must also be mentioned that the number of unconditioned reflexes which the animal possesses is quite considerable, and they are very diverse in their complexity. The teaching of conditioned and unconditioned reflexes introduced a materialistic conception in the field of science, which hitherto has been mainly occupied with the study of so-called instincts, of which we will speak later. The amazing picture of the mobility of the process of stimulation and inhibition in the cerebral cortex began to unfold gradually. The observer could study in detail the movement and distribution of these processes in the cerebral cortex. The experiments carried out by Pavlov and his students represented the true triumph of natural science. It turned out that the process of stimulation or inhibition originating in a limited area of the cerebral cortex is capable of diffusion along its nervous cells, irradiation. As contrasted to this, the concentration of the stimulating or inhibiting processes when the initially irradiated stimulation again becomes concentrated in a definite point in the cortex. Remarkable experiments were conducted in the Pavlov laboratory in order to observe the movement of the processes of stimulation or inhibition in the cerebral cortex. The cutaneous conditional reflexes were utilized for this purpose. Pressure on various areas of the skin of dogs served as a conditional stimulant. The pressure was effected by means of small touch devices which were attached to the skin, casca, in parentheses, and was accompanied by feeding. As a result, a conditioned salivation reflex was formed in response to skin stimulation. A group of such conditioned reflexes was produced by means of placing several of these devices in the skin of the dog's extremities at some distance from one another. To each point of contact of these devices naturally correspond a definite point in the cerebral cortex where the corresponding stimulation was projected. The conditioned reflexes which had been produced were very stable, so that their scope, measured by the quantity of saliva, was very consistent under ordinary conditions. One of these skin devices was changed into an inhibition stimulant. It is possible to arrange one inhibition device situated among other stimulating devices. An area of inhibition was formed in the corresponding points of the cortex. By measuring periodically the scope of the stimulating reflexes from the devices situated around the inhibition devices, one could easily trace the irradiation of inhibition, first from the initial point, then gradually involving all adjacent points in the cortex, and finally again concentrating itself in the initial point. Harvey, the famous English physiologist, used the quantitative indicator for the analysis of the conditions of cardiac work for the first time in the history of biology. The genius of Pavlov soared much higher. He subordinated the physiological processes which are at the basis of the psychic states to a strict quantitative numerical calculation. In a field where until recently supremely reigned fantasy, mysticism, and chaotic ideas, the experimenter was now able to ascertain the laws which govern the activity of the brain. The precise quantitative calculations of phenomena, based on a correct systematic foundation, enabled Pavlov to elicit new qualitative regulations in the function of the brain and particularly in the interlocking activity of the cortical cells. As new facts kept on accumulating in connection with the study of increasing larger number of animals, it became clear to Pavlov that the force interrelation and mobility of the basic processes, the stimulating and inhibiting ones, in the cerebral cortex can be completely different in various animals. This difference manifested itself particularly clear in the pathological deviations in the so-called experimental neurosis. The genius of Pavlov manifested itself clearly in a new generalization when the teaching on various types of higher nervous activity appeared. The classification of animal types was composed, and the type extremes were differentiated: the weak and the strong. New facts were brought out which demonstrated that the weak type rapidly loses, under difficult conditions, the faculty of normal functioning. These conclusions were confirmed during a calamity, the Great Flood in Leningrad, in September 1924, when the dogs had to be rescued from drowning. The animals reacted violently to the situation. Some time later, when normal conditions had been reestablished in the laboratory room, the experimenter let a stream of water into the room from under the door. The dog, which up to then was resisting or resting quietly in its stand, suddenly went into a rage. It lost its faculty of a normal balanced reaction to all stimulants which had been customarily used in the experiments. It refused food and was trying to break out of the stand. Pavlov detected in it the characteristics of a pathological neurotic condition. He conceived the idea of experimental neurosis in dogs. A new fascinating page was opened in the study of conditioned reflexes. Within not more than a year, Pavlov developed the teaching of experimental neurosis. Neurosis was produced under experimental conditions by means of the juxtaposition of an almost simultaneous action of stimulating and inhibiting agents. Since the possibility of artificially inducing neurosis in animals by employing various effects became a proven fact, a new perspective has been opened for the development of another field of study of cerebral activity: the experimental pathology and therapy of higher nervous activity. A number of experiments were carried out directed toward the search for methods of treatment of neurotic dogs. Drugs were tried out, among them the old favorite, bromide. The latter proved to be very effective. In using bromide for therapeutic purposes, one discovered remarkable phenomena. It turned out that the therapeutic efficacy of bromide depended to a large extent on the type of nervous activity. Positive results were obtained only when the dosage of bromide was adjusted to the individual characteristics of a given animal, which corresponded to the type of its nervous activity. It was often necessary to increase or reduce the dosage then, or even to increase or reproduce the dosage 10 or even 100-fold in various cases according to the differences in the animal type characteristics. If the same dose was used invariably on animals of various types, it could prove to be useful, neutral, or even harmful. This led to the important conclusion that measures of therapeutic action must not be used without discrimination, that they must be strictly individualized in accordance with the functional peculiarities of various types of nervous activity. The subsequent study of Pavlov of the problem of types of higher nervous activity led him to the discovery of still another important phenomena. In studying the relationship between the stimulating force and the corresponding degree of excitation in the cerebral cortex, Pavlov noticed that the proportional increases of the process of stimulation affected through the increasing force of the conditioned stimulant lasted only up to a certain limit. When the stimulating force surpassed the stimulant, or the limit of the excitability characteristic of a given type of nervous activity, instead of a continuing increase of excitation, an opposite reaction would set in: inhibition. The excitation would reach its limit and change to inhibition. One began to speak in the laboratory of the so-called post-liminal inhibition. What could be the physiological significance of this phenomena of post-liminal inhibition? In reflecting on this subject, Pavlov recalled some facts which he had observed some time back when he was studying the effects of the nervous system on cardiac activity. At that time, back in the 18th century, he advanced a suggestion based on his observation that cardiac nervous influences the metabolism and the nutrition of the cardiac muscle. Pavlov visualized an active state of an organ as a reaction which eventually leads to exhaustion. In accordance with this conception, inhibition reduced the activity of the brain connected with excitation, thus creating conditions for the restoration of its capacity to work. The conception of inhibition and its restorative role was applied to explain the essence of the post-liminal inhibition. As a point of departure was the idea that the cerebral cortex is subject to exhaustion as a result of the excessively strong excitations. The inhibition process get into action for the purpose of preventing further exhaustion of the cerebral cells which otherwise could be dangerous to their life activity. Under these circumstances, these processes play an essential protective role. Exhaustion, wrote Pavlov, is one of the main physiological impulses leading to the emergence of an inhibition process as a protective mechanism. In dogs of the weak type, i.e., liable to develop neurosis under trying experimental conditions, the post-liminal neurosis develops especially easy. Further observations demonstrated that post-liminal inhibition can play not only a protective role, but a therapeutic one as well. One began to talk of a protective or therapeutic inhibition. Thus, another exceptionally important problem faced practical medicine, the sleep therapy. At the beginning of the present century, I.P. Pavlov, in collaboration with his students, definitively demonstrated that the essence of natural sleep represents one of the forms of cortical inhibition. An idea came to the fore that the regular sleep is a form of inhibition due to the exhaustion of cortical cells following the day's work. Sleepiness toward the evening, according to Pavlov, represents a legitimate request of the cortex for some rest. Even stimulation of ordinary force, striking the tired cortex, acquired the characteristic of extra strength and induced inhibition sleep. Pavlov occupied himself seriously with the problem of the role and significance of inhibition sleep some time later. When he was expanding his studies of various types of neurosis, it came about as follows. Under the direct impression gathered from the observation of neurosis in animals, Ivan Petrovich turned to an analysis of certain mental diseases in man. He became interested in it first in 1918. The data which had collected in the study of experimental neurosis enabled him to correctly interpret certain forms of mental disturbances. It became clear to him that the disturbance of sleep has some significance in the understanding of a disease. In this respect, particularly instructive was the case of patient K, who has remained in a sleep-like state, a so-called lethargic sleep, almost continuously for 20 years. Cases of a lethargic condition were observed previously, but the observations on K acquired a particular interest in view of the exceptional duration of the illness. Pavlov himself participated in the observation of the patient. During the process of recovery, the patient would wake up occasionally to take food. He was receiving liquid food during his sleep through a sound, which introduced into the esophagus. He would wake up only at night when the daylight noise, slight as it was in the hospital, would completely die down. Under these conditions, his nervous system, capable to cope with a minimal amount of stimulation only, retained certain excitability. But at the slightest, most significant stimulus, slamming of a door or entrance of the ward attendant, the patient would again sink into sleep. The postliminal protective inhibition would assert itself in the cerebral cortex. This reaction served as a protection to the patient and his weak nervous system from stimuli which assumed the character of super-irritations. It seems to me, Pavlov used to say, that while the inhibition is present in man, there is no need to lose hope. Here, a man has been lying like a living corpse for 20 years. Only inhibition saved his brain from irreparable ruin. The results of these observations led Pavlov to define or definite conclusions. Sleep, be it pathological or normal, represents a defensive, protective reaction for the benefit of the nervous system. A periodical normal sleep, said he, is unquestionably the result of exhaustion. Sleep is a state of inactivity, of rest of the large hemispheres. The logical deduction followed that it is possible to employ sleep as a therapeutic measure in certain forms of mental diseases. The first attempts brought remarkable results in some cases. Narcotics were used abroad to put patients to sleep. The question in connection with this was whether the therapeutic effect was due to the physiological sleep or to the effect of strong narcotics. Only the students of Pavlov employed the therapeutic effect of sleep on a correct basis. In using mild soporific drugs instead of a powerful narcotics, they tried to prolong natural sleep. Pavlov's deductions received full justification when his closest associate, M.K. Petrova, began to employ as a therapeutic measure hypnotic sleep, not connected with the administration of alien to the body narcotic drugs, even if they were given in small doses. The introduction into practice of electrosleep also represents an important achievement. The correctness of Vavilov's teaching of sleep therapy has been amply corroborated by the positive results obtained at present in many therapeutic institutions. The sleep treatment of certain mental and nervous disorders proved to be very effective. It is of definite benefit in certain cases of the treatment of the so-called internal diseases, hypertonic and ulcer diseases, which develop on account of prolonged pathological disturbances of the nervous system. However, the use of sleep therapy must be limited to a definite circle of diseases. Widening it beyond this circle may only be harmful. There are diseases which must not be treated via inhibition, but, on the contrary, by means of the stimulation of the central nervous system. The observations of people placed before Pavlov the problem of the differences in the higher nervous activity of humans, as compared to that of humans. In continuing his observations on patients at the psychiatric clinic, which had been specially created at his laboratory in 1931, Pavlov came upon a new remarkable generalization. In 1932, he drew up the first outline of his teachings of the two-signal system of conditioned reflexes in man. But before we shall come to this special question of the characteristics of the higher nervous activity in man, we must summarize what had been said above. I.M. Sekhanov was the first naturalist scientist who, with extraordinary courage, particularly for his time, asserted that any manifestation of mental or sensory activity is based on the reflexes of the brain. Experimental proof of this genial sweep of Sekhanov's thought, as Pavlov expressed it, came much later, but even at that time his contemporaries fully valued the great significance of the materialistic ideas of Sekhanov. The progressive elements of the community, especially the students and youth, gathered around the name of Sekhanov, as if around a banner which inspired them to fight for materialistic science and against mysticism and obscurantism. The czarist officials and the representative of clergy guessed that the essence of Sekhanov's teachings was being directed as a powerful thrust against the mythical ideas of the soul, that is, was destroying the very stronghold of idealistic religious interpretations of psychics and psychic activity. They declared an implacable war against Sekhanov in his book, The Brain Reflexes. Valuev, the czarist, satirist, that could be satirist, I'm not sure, czarist, minister of internal affairs, stressed the harmful trend of brain reflexes in stating that to interpret in a particular book, even from a physiological point of view, the internal psychic functions of man as the result of external influences on the nerves and as the reflection of these influences in the brain means substituting the teaching of the immorality of the spirit with a new teaching which recognizes only matter in man. The Kiev Archbishop Boris published a book on the impossibility of purely physiological explanation of the psychic life of man. It is not difficult to see that even the title is directed against Sekhanov. It is known that Sekhanov had to change the original title of his book at the request of the Tsarist censorship, which had forbidden the title which Sekhanov had originally given to his book, an attempt to introduce a physiological basis in the psychic process. Thus, the secular as well as the clerical powers bore down on Sekhanov and his book, in regard to which the censorship attempted to do all it could to prevent its publication. True, the legal trial of Sekhanov did not take place, since the indubitable outcome of the trial would have made Sekhanov even more popular. However, the Tsarist bureaucrats succeeded in forbidding the publishing of the book in the Ceremenic Contemporary Journal, edited by N.G. Chernizevsky. Permission was granted to publish it in the journal of Mediciniski Vestnik, which is called the Medical Herald, which had a comparatively small circulation. At this, the clerics and bureaucrats entertained hope that the new title, Brain Reflexes, in view of its vagueness, would limit the circle of people who could become interested in this book. Nevertheless, the materialistic views of Sekhanov became widely known and popular already at the time when the book was forbidden, and the progressive readers used the handwritten text of the issue. In spite of the persecution and injunctions, the Brain Reflexes opened a new page in science, the materialistic analysis of psychic activity. Over 50 years of indefeatable research by Pavlov and the legion of his students corroborated experimentally the correctness of the theoretical premise of Sekhanov. Pavlov created an objective method of study for psychic phenomena, which put an end to the fruitless attempts of using a subjective method in psychic research. The scientific objective method of study permitted an elucidation and correct description of the basic regularities of cerebral functions. Within a short time, the method of conditioned reflexes grew into a theory of conditioned reflexes. The teaching of higher nervous activity originated. It was proved incontrovertibly that in spite of the complexity of the external manifestations of behavior, at the base of it are the mechanisms of conditioned and unconditioned reflexes, in their multiple diversity of combinations and interrelations. There are no other but reflex reactions in the brain. This conclusion, thus, became the mainstay of the materialistic monoism of Pavlov, the myth of the allegedly existing soul, a substance self-reliant and independent of the body, which in various hues is invariably the essence of any religious belief, has been completely discredited. The teaching of Pavlov irrefutably proved that the entire substance of psychic activity can be understood by means of objective methods of investigation. Having completed the gigantic work of substantiating the materialistic theory of the so-called activity of the soul, Pavlov advanced the study of the most important problem connected with the need of eliciting the causation of the psychic phenomena. Hence, the origin of ideas, and studies which demonstrated the formation of nervous activity under the effect of external stimuli, depending on their various types. This very idea of the formation, i.e., the development of higher nervous activity, and its variability is in itself highly interesting. The causative conditioning, the dependence of the process of higher nervous activity on external conditions, leads to the idea of the possibility of interfering or interfering in these processes by means of influencing the external conditions and circumstances.